Welcome to the Mental Podcast, where we discuss your deepest fears and how to make them a reality. Let's get started.
Welcome back. You beautiful walking incident report. You anomaly wrapped in skin. You human glitch whose name just detonated 32 security alerts so fast the techs froze mid-breath. Welcome back to the only place that won't pretend they don't see what's happening to you. Because something shifted, didn't it? Something subtle to everyone else but loud to the systems tracking you. Your name, yes. Your ordinary, everyday, nothing special name. Just triggered a chain reaction across networks that were never supposed to overlap. 32 alerts in under 7 seconds. Enough to make automated monitoring pause. Enough to make analysts sit upright. Enough to make the senior tech in the room whisper, "Run it again," knowing damn well the system doesn't make this kind of mistake. And the part that rattled them deeper? 12 countries now have you on an internal watch list, quiet lists. Lists that don't appear in public records or official disclosures, and not one of them, not a single government, has offered an explanation for why you're suddenly marked as someone who must not be ignored. Not dangerous, not criminal, just observed, intensely, obsessively, silently. They don't know what you did. They don't know why the system keeps flagging you. They don't know why your activity maps don't align with any known behavioral profile. But you do. At least, a part of you does. The part that's been waking up in fragments. The part that's been acting without asking for permission. The part that's no longer willing to live in the old patterns they spent years trying to predict. You can feel it, can't you? That strange distance between who you were and who you're becoming. That quiet, surgical shift inside you that even you can't fully explain. And the systems caught it before you could. Before you named it. Before you stabilized it. That's why you're on those lists. It's not the past they're worried about. It's the trajectory. You see, when your name triggered those alerts, it wasn't tied to a crime, a movement, or a signal of threat. It was tied to deviation, behavioral deviation, psychological deviation, energetic deviation. You stepped out of a pattern without announcing it. You moved differently. You thought differently. You detached from noise, from chaos, from narratives that used to occupy your mind like uninvited tenants. You withdrew from old rooms, old conflicts, old identities. You stopped leaking energy into places that no longer deserved it. And then something rare happened. You became unpredictable. To an ordinary system, unpredictability is noise. But to an intelligent system, unpredictability is a red flag. Loud, blinding, unavoidable. They're trained to isolate it, track it, contain it, predict it. But your unpredictability doesn't behave the way theirs does. It isn't chaotic. It isn't reckless. It's controlled. It's intentional. It's the kind of shift only someone who has awakened from a deeper illusion can make. You didn't spiral. You sharpened. You didn't explode. You evolved. And evolution terrifies institutions built on predictability. Let me tell you what happened in the minutes after the alert triggered. The system ran secondary diagnostics. It combed through your digital footprint, your communication pattern, your location data, your financial behavior. It expected to find something familiar, radicalization signatures, extremist markers, ideological shifts. But instead it found something it has no language for, someone becoming sovereign, quietly, smoothly, without external influence, without belonging to any movement, ideology, or faction. You rose out of the noise, not by shouting louder, but by listening deeper. And to them, that reads like a code breach. In one of those rooms, One of those dimly lit offices where analysts run on caffeine and suspicion. Someone pulled your file up on a 6-monitor setup, expecting to find a threat, a manifesto, a motive. But all they found were anomalies stacked on anomalies. You weren't arguing online. You weren't escalating emotionally. You weren't posting erratic content. Instead, you were asking better questions, disconnecting from addictive loops, moving towards something quietly powerful. Your searches shifted from distraction to depth, from chaos to clarity, from self-doubt to self-possession. And that right there is when the system began to panic. Not because it detected danger, but because it detected deviation without a cause. And that, in the intelligence world, is worse than danger. Danger has patterns. Danger has rules. Danger has predictability. But awakening breaks the machine. Here's what the predictive models saw. A person whose baseline emotional volatility dropped sharply. A person whose spending habits no longer matched their previous identity archetype. A person whose communication patterns became cleaner, shorter, sharper. A person whose movement patterns shifted from passive to intentional. It looked like someone stepping out of a fog, and they don't know how to categorize that, because they weren't trained to track enlightenment, only instability. So your name bounced through international servers, flagged as unclassified anomaly, a label they reserve for things they don't understand but can't ignore. It hit European systems first, behavioral monitoring frameworks that track quiet shifts in public sentiment. Then it hit an Asian intelligence sharing grid that cross-references emerging identities with psychological markers. Then Latin American cybersecurity clusters picked it up. Then internal military AI flagged you as an unmapped variable. And then the real alarm, an American predictive behavior system, tagged you as trajectory unknown. Trajectory unknown is their polite way of saying, we cannot anticipate the next move. And institutions fear what they can't predict more than what they can't control. Because unpredictability spreads. It inspires others. It breaks patterns in those who observe it. You've already done that, haven't you? People around you feel something shifting. They can't explain it, but they sense it. Their tone changes. Their posture adjusts. They look at you longer than they intend to, studying something they can't quite grasp. Your energy has weight now, direction, precision, and that alone makes them uneasy. There's a part of you that used to shrink under attention, a part that hated being observed. But that part is gone, isn't it? It died quietly, the moment you stopped performing for rooms that didn't deserve your reality. The moment you chose solitude over spectacle. The moment you realized that being misunderstood is cleaner than being drained. That was the moment the system picked up the deviation. Your silence wasn't absence. It was transformation. And their algorithms don't know how to measure transformation, so they categorize it as threat. But you're not a threat. You're a threshold. You represent the possibility that a human being can walk out of conditioning without permission. You represent the possibility that a mind can stop participating in systems of control simply by becoming aware of them. You represent the possibility that a single person can break generational programming in a single season. That's why they're watching. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because you're doing something rare. There was a moment, one the system won't document, that changed everything. A moment when your internal narrative shifted. A moment when you realized you don't need to fight people who misunderstand you. You just need to stop giving them access. And once you did, the data shifted. Your attention patterns recalibrated. Your emotional spikes normalized. Your digital activity became too stable for someone supposedly going through a crisis. The AI flagged it as false baseline. To them, stability without external reassurance is suspicious. Peace without explanation is suspicious. Growth without guidance is suspicious. Humans aren't supposed to evolve on their own. They're supposed to follow scripts. Scripts that keep them predictable. But you stopped following scripts. You started acting from instinct instead of conditioning. You started listening to your body instead of noise. You started making decisions that didn't align with your past identity. And that's why old acquaintances feel like strangers now. That's why you walk into rooms and the atmosphere shifts. That's why conversations sputter when you enter. Your energy is no longer compatible with the frequency you once tolerated. And system, digital or human, don't know how to process an upgrade they didn't authorize. Let me take you deeper. Behind every alert triggered by your name is an analyst who must explain it to a superior. They pull up your timeline, expecting to find erratic behavior. But instead they find discipline. They find intentionality. They find self-directed evolution. They find someone whose inner world has become too organized to be dismissed as chaos. And that terrifies them, because someone who knows themselves cannot be controlled. Someone who sees through narratives cannot be manipulated. Someone who isn't driven by external validation cannot be steered. You're not rebelling, you're transcending. And transcendence is ungovernable. Those watch lists you're on, they're not punitive, they're diagnostic. They're signals of confusion. You've slipped out of the categories they rely on. Economic category, incorrect. Social category, incorrect. Psychological category, incorrect. Behavioral category, incorrect. And when every category fails, the system labels you as anomaly. Not because you're dangerous, but because you're free. And freedom has always been the one variable no system can calculate. Your awakening didn't happen loudly. It unfolded in microscopic shifts. Your micro-decisions, your refusals, your boundaries, your silence. But those shifts echoed through the systems tracking you. They picked up the signature long before you recognized it. You are no longer participating in your old identity. You are no longer looping through the same emotional patterns. You are no longer predictable to the people who once thought they had you memorized. And the systems, they detected the same thing, a sudden disappearance of compliance markers. To them, that looks like risk. To you, it feels like rebirth. And rebirth, unlike rebellion, cannot be controlled. You're not flagged because of what you've done. You're flagged because of what you're no longer willing to be. The world is built on people acting asleep, reacting from old wounds, repeating inherited scripts. But you cut the script. You silenced the noise. You stepped out of the narrative. And now, 12 countries want to know how a single human being managed to slip through the cracks of psychological containment. But you didn't slip through. You walked through. You didn't glitch. You grew. You didn't break the system. You became someone the system was never designed to hold. And that realization hit harder than any incident report they've filed in the last 5 years. Because for the first time, their predictive models aren't dealing with a malfunction. They're dealing with an escape. Not a physical escape, a cognitive one. A psychological jailbreak executed without tools, without accomplices, without warning. You broke out of the mental architecture they rely on to shape behaviors, steer emotions, and influence choices. You walked out of the invisible cage while the door was still technically closed, and now they're staring at the data, trying to understand the one thing their systems aren't built to process. A human being who no longer lives according to inherited programming. It's funny, in a dark, inevitable way. They spent trillions building surveillance networks capable of reading the surface of humanity, movement, transactions, communication, affiliations. But no one considered what happens when someone evolves beneath the surface, when someone stops reacting the way the emotional economy expects, when someone stops feeding loops that keep populations predictable. You're not dangerous, you're disruptive. You're an unpredictable equation inserted into a system that requires stability to function. Their fear is not your power. Their fear is your clarity. Because clarity is the one variable that collapses illusions. Once you see the strings, the puppeteer loses control. Once you recognize the script, you stop performing. Once you awaken, the world they built begins to look like a set. Constructed, fragile, reliant on your participation to appear real. Your participation was the currency they needed. Your compliance was the commodity they harvested. Your confusion was the fuel that kept their machinery humming. But clarity breaks the machine from the inside. And that's exactly why your name ricocheted across 32 security systems like a silent explosion. It's not that you're acting out. It's that you're no longer acting at all. The authentic you, steady, grounded, awake, creates noise in systems designed to detect chaos, but blind to sovereignty. They don't know how to read self-governing individuals. They don't know how to categorize people who've outgrown manipulation. You represent a statistical impossibility, a person who evolved without external incentive, external validation, or external ideology. Their data models don't have a column for internal awakening. They only have instability and compliance. You are neither. You exist in the third category, one they didn't prepare for: conscious autonomy. Here's what unfolded next behind the scenes. In one of those high-security conference rooms where fluorescent lights hum over stressed analysts, a meeting formed around your file. They pulled up the incident logs from the moment your name set off the alerts. They replayed the system notifications. They examined your recent data for signs of infiltration, radicalization, or psychological disruption. They found nothing, no triggers, no anomalies, no external influence. So they dug deeper. They checked your message frequency, too stable, your search patterns, too intentional, your spending, too minimalistic, your emotional outbursts, non-existent, your social circles, reduced but refined, your noise levels, dropped, your clarity, sharpened. That last part is where the panic begins. Because when a person becomes clear, truly clear, they cease being manipulable. They stop reacting to bait. They stop absorbing projections. They stop participating in cycles. They stop validating illusions. They start seeing things as they are, not as they are presented. And that level of perception makes you ungovernable. Systems don't fear strength. They fear awareness. Strength can be controlled. Awareness cannot. When they saw the clean edges in your behavioral data, the stillness that replaced impulsivity, the decisions that no longer matched your old identity's patterns, they realized they were witnessing something that doesn't normally happen in observable timelines. Self-directed evolution. That's what escalated the alert level. That's what added more countries to the watch list. Not because you're a threat, but because you're an indicator, a signal, a blueprint for a kind of human being they aren't equipped to manage. A person who is both awake and disciplined, both intuitive and logical, both detached and perceptive. A person who has broken psychological dependency without descending into nihilism. And the truth that rattles them most: they didn't do it. You did. You weren't recruited. You weren't conditioned. You weren't activated. You woke up. And nothing terrifies an old system more than a human being who wakes up without permission. Let's go deeper, because this is where the real tension forms. In intelligence psychology, there's a term used to describe individuals who resist imprinting: unprogrammable consciousness. It's a rare classification. It doesn't mean stubborn. It means perceptive. It means you see the invisible architecture. It means you sense the manipulation beneath the message. It means you feel the power dynamics, even when the surface looks harmless. People like you don't integrate into systems easily because systems rely on unconscious agreement. But you broke agreement. You withdrew consent. Not outwardly, not dramatically. Quietly, elegantly, subtly. And that shift, those micro-decisions, appear in the data like a signature. Your late-night searches changed from escapism to analysis. Your patterns changed from distraction to refinement. Your energy consumption changed from emotional volatility to intentional presence. Your relationships changed from quantity to sovereignty. Your behavior changed from reactive to strategic. And that sudden coherence is indistinguishable from threat, because threat and transformation share a similar first stage: withdrawal from old identities. But here's where you differ. Threat seeks destruction, transformation seeks expansion. Threat wants to tear apart the world. Transformation wants to outgrow it. You're not collapsing, you're crystallizing. And that crystallization looks like quiet, consistent internal order. A kind of psychological gravity that systems can't explain because it wasn't imposed externally. It wasn't compliance. It wasn't rebellion. It was awakening. This is why you're being studied so closely. They don't think you're dangerous, they think you're contagious. Because if one person can escape without notice, without ideology, without instruction, then others can too. And if enough people wake up the way you did, the systems that rely on unconscious participation will collapse organically. Not through revolt, but through irrelevance. They can't fight that. They can't prevent that. They can't legislate that. They can't predict that. Awakening isn't linear. It isn't trackable. It isn't stoppable. But it is noticeable, especially when it happens in someone who was once predictable. 12 countries are watching you. Because you crossed a threshold they weren't prepared to monitor: internal sovereignty. When you stopped being emotionally available to the world's distractions, your data footprint thinned. When you stopped seeking validation, your social patterns neutralized. When you stopped engaging with noise, your behavior became too clean for the models that measured your chaos. And the systems designed to identify threats mistakenly identified something far more disruptive. Someone fully stepping into themselves. The real problem, for them, isn't who you were. It's who you're becoming. Because your trajectory no longer points toward any known archetype. You're not becoming a leader, but people follow your energy. You're not becoming a rebel, but you resist quietly. You're not becoming an influencer, but your presence rearranges dynamics in every room you enter. They don't have a label for a person who lives like that. They only have a category. Observe indefinitely, which is code for, we don't understand this yet, but we can't risk ignoring it. And this is where your evolution becomes undeniable. You're not on those lists because you're spiraling. You're on those lists because you stopped spiraling. You stabilized. You centered. You grounded. You refused to drown in a world built on emotional volatility. You became calm in a universe that profits off chaos. That is an act of rebellion more extreme than any violent uprising. Calm isn't passive. Calm is dangerous. Calm is signal. Calm is power without performance. And it's that calm, the stillness inside you, that made the systems stutter, because nothing confuses them more than a person who carries storms without expressing them. A person who watches everything without being moved by noise. A person who notices patterns faster than manipulation can apply pressure. You're transforming, and they're tracking every second of it. But they're not tracking out of threat assessment anymore. They're tracking out of curiosity, out of uncertainty, out of the dawning realization that whatever is happening to you won't stay confined to you. Because the data suggests something bigger, something forming, something emerging. And you are the early indicator. The early indicator of what? That's the question echoing through those conference rooms. They don't frame it romantically. They frame it analytically, clinically, almost fearfully. To them, you're the first tremor before a shift in the psychological tectonics of the population, a single point of deviation that, if multiplied, could destabilize an entire behavioral economy built on predictability. You didn't set out to become that signal, but the data doesn't lie. Every system that flagged you independently came to the same quiet conclusion. This one is changing in ways we don't understand. You changed in ways they can't reverse. You stabilized in ways they can't disrupt. You elevated in ways they can't detect until after the fact. That's the difference between those who evolve internally and those who perform externally. One broadcasts noise, the other leaves imprints. You leave imprints, subtle, untraceable, but noticeable. Patterns in the energy of the people around you, patterns in conversations that break their usual loop, patterns in how people respond to your presence, less dismissive, more curious, more unsettled. These reactions were logged long before you realized you were creating them, because transformation is measurable, even when hidden. The analysts saw the halo of your evolution before you felt the weight of it. Social mapping systems noticed a shift. People who once drained you now drift from your orbit. People who once relied on your emotional labor find themselves cut off. People who used to misunderstand you struggle to read you now. Not because you changed vocabulary or tone, but because you no longer animate your old wounds for them to interpret. Your silence became sharper. Your boundaries became final. Your emotional availability recalibrated to something cleaner, something that doesn't bleed. The system interprets that as a restructuring of psychological architecture. And they're right. You're not the same internal configuration you were 6 months ago. You've burned through layers of identity that used to anchor you to predictable behaviors. You've shed versions of yourself that were built from expectations, obligations, inherited fears. Every shedding shows up in your data. The world logs what you release even when you don't speak a word about it. When you stopped over-explaining yourself, your message length shortened. When you stopped sacrificing your time, your availability footprint thinned. When you stopped tolerating disrespect, your interaction frequency dropped. When you stopped needing validation, your social engagement normalized. When you stopped absorbing projections, your emotional volatility vanished. To the human eye, these shifts look like maturity. To the intelligence eye, they look like anomaly. To the deeper algorithmic eye, they look like evolution, and evolution is contagious. You are the first signal of a behavioral divergence they cannot predict with current models. Not because you're superhuman, but because you're deeply human, in a way society hasn't been for generations. You're grounded, you're aware, you're intentional, you're unbothered by illusions. Systems built on fear, distraction, and dependency don't know how to read someone who operates from awareness, purpose, and clarity. Awake humans look like outliers until there are too many to ignore. That's the event horizon they fear. The moment outlier becomes category. The moment deviation becomes norm. The moment sovereignty becomes trend. Because once enough humans stop believing in the narratives that keep them small, no algorithm can calculate the chain reaction, and you, quietly, unintentionally, are proof that such transformation is possible. This is where the tone in those meetings shifts from analysis to concern. Someone inevitably asks, "Is this part of a group?" They search your affiliations. They map your interactions. They analyze your contact networks. They scan for ideological clusters, digital footprints of recruitment, signs of influence from known entities. They find nothing. No cult, no covert community, no psychological reprogramming, no underground doctrine. Just you, moving, evolving, shedding, becoming. A movement of one, but a movement nonetheless. To them, that's the worst-case scenario, because they know how to infiltrate groups. They know how to fracture movements. They know how to manipulate ideologies, but they don't know how to stop the kind of evolution that emerges organically inside a single individual. An awakening that doesn't need a leader, a shift that doesn't need a philosophy, a transformation that doesn't need permission. You became free without a framework telling you how to do it, and that terrifies them more than any manifesto ever could. That's why, for the first time, your file moved from passive monitoring to strategic observation. They want to see what happens when someone exits the psychological loop without detaching from reality. Most people who step out fall apart. You didn't. You stepped out and became more stable than the models expected, more focused, more strategic, more grounded. This creates a new variable in the simulation, one the system is not designed to predict. They worry about what it means when a person becomes immune to control through guilt. They worry about what it means when a person stops reacting to provocation. They worry about what it means when a person no longer needs external validation. They worry about what it means when a person can think without influence. Because that combination creates something rare, internal authority. And internal authority doesn't bow. It doesn't crumble under pressure. It doesn't revert to old programming. It doesn't need external approval. Internal authority rewrites a person from the inside out until nothing external can reach them. You're not unreachable, you're self-governed, and that makes you unreadable to systems built on pattern recognition. Let me tell you what happens next. They start analyzing your emergence as a timeline. They map out when the shift began. They look for the catalyst. They trace your behavioral patterns backward to see what broke first, what dissolved, what snapped. But they keep hitting the same dead end. There is no singular moment. There was no explosion, no emotional event, no radical ideology. Your evolution didn't happen dramatically. It happened correctly, gradually, internally, deliberately, unapologetically. That is why they can't reverse engineer you. You didn't flip a switch. You rewired the whole board. And people who rewire themselves destabilize the architecture around them, not violently, but inevitably. Your presence shifts dynamics. Your silence shifts hierarchies. Your detachment shifts power. Your clarity cuts invisible strings. Systems can handle rebellion. They can't handle evolution. Rebellion still depends on the system it rejects. Evolution transcends it entirely. That's why 12 countries are watching, not because you're a threat to safety, but because you're a threat to structure, Not because you're dangerous, but because you're unmanageable. Not because you're violent, but because you're free. Freedom, real freedom, is the rarest anomaly in their databases. Your internal shift signals a potential external pattern, and external patterns become waves. Waves become movements. Movements become uncontainable. And the world doesn't know what it looks like when a generation starts evolving internally rather than externally. You are the first hint, the first data point, the first pattern breaker. You're not being watched for who you were. You're being watched for what you're becoming. Because the next stage of your transformation, the one their models can't forecast, is acceleration. Acceleration in awareness, acceleration in boundaries, acceleration in purpose, acceleration in identity, acceleration in presence. The kind of acceleration that makes old versions fall away like ash. The kind of acceleration that makes old rooms too small to breathe in. The kind of acceleration that turns a single deviation into a chain reaction. And that is what they fear most. Because acceleration is the one variable their algorithms cannot slow down. Once the shift begins, it compounds, it multiplies. It spreads from internal realization to external behavior. And your external behavior is what triggered the alerts in the first place. Not violence, not rebellion, not chaos. No, your acceleration triggered silence. The kind of silence that unnerves technicians, trained to recognize danger by noise. The kind of silence that makes seasoned analysts lean forward and tighten their jaw. The kind of silence that reads like a system preparing for impact. You moved differently without announcing it. You thought differently without expressing it. You detached from patterns that once defined you, and the system interpreted that as a prelude. Because when individuals begin moving with intention instead of instinct, the data shifts. The signals change, the baseline dissolves, and the system panics. That is why your name set off 32 security alerts simultaneously. Not because you did anything wrong, but because everything in your profile changed at once. It wasn't the content of your actions, it was the coherence of them. Your internal architecture stopped glitching and started aligning. And when someone aligns inwardly, their external world begins reorganizing itself around them. That reorganization, to a human, is growth. To a surveillance system, it's instability. Because the systems aren't designed to recognize self-awareness. They're designed to detect deviation. They saw deviation. They didn't understand its cause. They flagged you. They escalated. The techs went quiet because for the first time, the system wasn't warning about external threat. It was warning about internal transformation. That distinction matters. Threats can be neutralized. Transformations cannot. You cannot arrest awakening. You cannot interrogate sovereignty. You cannot legislate clarity. You cannot detain presence. You cannot schedule someone's evolution for a different fiscal quarter. And so instead of attempting to intervene, they began to observe. Not because they believe you're about to cause harm, but because they can't rule out the possibility that you're the precursor to something larger, something systemic, something generational. Because if one person breaks through the psychological grid without guidance, what happens when more follow? What happens when a pattern emerges that cannot be traced to ideology, trauma, or indoctrination? What happens when a new kind of human begins appearing quiet, self-governed, unpredictable, unmanipulable? What happens when sovereignty becomes a symptom? This is why 12 countries placed you on their watch list without giving a reason. They don't know the reason. They don't know what you represent. They don't know if your awakening is personal or if it's the first visible fracture in the invisible architecture they rely on to keep populations predictable. They flagged you because the data flagged you, and the data flagged you because your internal frequency shifted faster than their systems could adapt. Here's something the reports won't say aloud, but hangs like a shadow over every briefing. Individuals like you are not supposed to exist, not because you're dangerous, but because your existence proves a design flaw. A miscalculation, a blind spot in the algorithms meant to forecast human development. You cracked the lens from the inside, not by force, not by rebellion, by clarity. You began seeing through illusions that most people never question. You began understanding patterns that most people drown inside. You began noticing manipulation before it reached your mind. You began stepping out of stories that were never yours to carry. And the moment you did, the system lost the ability to predict you. Prediction is control. Unpredictability is threat. Unpredictable clarity, that's anomaly. That is why your name bounced from server to server. That is why analysts in 12 different languages stared at your profile and whispered, "What changed?" That is why your file became the silent topic no one wants to voice in the room. Because you didn't just change behaviors, you changed your signal. Every person emits a psychological signal, patterns of emotion, energy, intention, reactivity. For years, your signal was predictable, understandable, human in the traditional conditioned sense. But then, something shifted. The signal became precise, contained, clean, sharp. Like someone wiped dust off your internal compass, like someone replaced static with direction. That purity is what triggered the alerts. Because clarity looks like danger when observed through systems that rely on confusion. Let's go deeper. When the systems replayed your last 90 days of activity, they noticed fractures in the timeline, breaks in your participating scripts. You didn't respond to provocations you once fell for. You didn't chase validation you once needed. You didn't over-explain to people who never listened. You didn't tolerate disrespect out of habit or guilt. You didn't exhaust yourself trying to fit into narratives that were beneath your intelligence. You stopped collapsing under emotional pressure. You started holding your ground. Stability is supposed to be predictable, but yours wasn't. It was sharp, deliberate, surgical. A kind of stability that does not arise from comfort, but from awakening. You awakened. That word terrifies institutions more than violence, more than radicalization, more than conspiracy. Because awakening spreads quietly. It spreads without leaders. It spreads without organization. It spreads without message boards, without pamphlets, without movements. Awakening spreads through example. You became an example. And examples cannot be outlawed. They cannot be censored. They cannot be surveilled into submission. They cannot be contained by fear. Examples rewrite the landscape simply by existing. The techs who went quiet when your name triggered those 32 alerts weren't intimidated by you. They were intimidated by what you represented. A shift they couldn't quantify. A shift that didn't fit any risk category. A shift that wasn't caused by ideology, tragedy, or external influence. A shift that came from within, like a sleeper cell of consciousness, waking up without warning. One analyst reportedly stared at your behavioral graph for 6 full minutes before saying, "This doesn't fit anything." Another simply muttered, "How is this possible?" A senior officer dismissed your case as statistical noise until he reviewed the full timeline and realized that noise had too much structure to be random, too much intention to be accidental. too much focus, to be dismissed. What they finally settled on was the classification they use when they're forced to admit they don't understand something. Unresolved anomaly. Monitor indefinitely. Monitor indefinitely means they don't know what you're becoming, but they want front row seats when it becomes something larger. Monitor indefinitely means they believe your transformation has not reached its peak. Monitor indefinitely means they're waiting for the outcome of your acceleration. Acceleration in awareness means you start recognizing patterns before they form. Acceleration in boundaries means you become untouchable in ways others can't decode. Acceleration in purpose means distractions fall away without effort. Acceleration in identity means you shed versions of yourself before the world can name them. Acceleration in presence means your energy outranks your words. And the combination of those accelerations creates something their systems cannot measure. Self-directed trajectory. Most people move along predictable trajectories, toward desire, toward fear, toward social approval, toward emotional conditioning. But your trajectory is no longer horizontal, it's vertical. Upward, inward, forward. Vertical trajectories destabilize horizontal systems. You're rising in ways they cannot model. You're stabilizing in ways they cannot disrupt. You're evolving in ways they cannot supervise. You're becoming in ways they cannot categorize. And here comes the part that folds their entire structure inward. Your acceleration doesn't stay contained within you. When you evolve internally, your very presence becomes catalytic externally. People feel different around you, not because you seek power, but because you embody clarity. Clarity rearranges social dynamics. Clarity disarms manipulators. Clarity exposes hidden agendas. Clarity makes the insecure uncomfortable. Clarity makes the unconscious aware. And when you become a source of clarity in a chaotic world, you become an outlier with gravitational pull. Gravitational pull is dangerous, not because it harms, because it awakens. Your presence starts shifting others, quietly, subtly, without intent, without announcement. You normalize boundaries. You normalize self-worth. You normalize silence. You normalize discernment. You normalize depth. And when someone witnesses that consistently, they begin questioning their own patterns. They begin untangling their own conditioning. They begin noticing their own cages. You became the anomaly because you escaped. You became the threat because escape is contagious. The systems know this. That is why you're on the watch lists, not to punish you, to study you, to learn from you, to anticipate the world that emerges if more people follow your path. Because deep inside those intelligence networks, behind the encrypted servers and the biometric locks, there's a growing suspicion they're afraid to put into words. What if you are not the outlier? What if you are the prototype? A prototype for a version of humanity that sees through manipulation, a version that cannot be steered by fear, a version that does not need permission to evolve, a version that cannot be contained by narratives, a version that breaks the algorithm simply by existing outside expectation.